The subject of our interview today is government and public sector cuts. Now, if there's one thing almost everybody seems agreed on, and that's the too many managers in the health service. Now, we've got somebody at Cranfield that's doing an extensive study of managers in the health service, Professor David Buchanan. Now, David, is it true? Have we got too many managers?
Well, Steve, if you look at the official statistics, you'll see that in 2009, the NHS had around 20,000 managers and senior managers, according to the official statistics. By the end of 2009, that had ballooned out of all proportion to almost 45,000. And those are the figures that are most often quoted when that accusation is expressed. If, however, you look at total NHS employment in 1999 and again in 2009, and look at the proportion of managers over that decade, one has to conclude that the number of managers over that period has ballooned from just over 2% of the total NHS employment to just over 3%. And if one considers the kinds of pressures and demands that the service has been under over that decade, including the creation of foundation trusts, which are expected to function more as commercial businesses, to compete, to structure themselves as businesses, and the many other changes that the NHS has demanded that hospitals make, one might be astonished that the number of managers hasn't increased considerably more than it in fact has.
Now, the argument is often that these people are supporting a bureaucracy that in fact isn't necessary, that if you chop things down to the essentials, then many of these managers wouldn't be needed.
I think the first part of your statement, Steve, is absolutely correct. A lot of those managers, especially middle managers, are supporting a vast regulatory regime. So when they're accused of being bureaucrats and paper shufflers, to some extent that's true. But is that the job that they themselves would wish to be doing? Because they also play a major role when they can find the time in change, development and service improvement. And worth also pointing out that the regulatory regime, the bureaucracy that they're accused of generating, has in fact been generated by government policy. A review last year identified a minimum of 35 different regulatory, auditing and inspecting agencies to which hospital trusts are subject. And all of those agencies, all of those inspectorates can ask for similar information, only in different formats. That burden of regulation is externally imposed. This isn't a bureaucracy that the managers themselves have created. It's been created for them and prevents them from doing the proper management job.
So if I said to you, look, the clarion call is preserve the front line, trim things back so you've just got the front line, would we miss out on very much?
I think we have to accept that in healthcare, as probably in any other sector, there's more than one front line. In health, one of those front lines is, of course, patient care. The other front line is, of course, delivering service improvement, change. And certainly the government's own policy documents towards the end of last year were arguing for major, transformational, radical, rapid change, as is the current coalition government, which is expecting the NHS to deliver over the next 2 to 3 years £20 billion in efficiency savings. Now that generates a major change agenda, a challenging change agenda. Who is going to deliver that change agenda if you cut management jobs? One front line here is treating patients. The other front line is change, development, service improvement. If you want that other front line to deliver, then one has to not cut managers, but free them up to do that job.
And what's the recipe for doing that?
For me, at the moment, the recipe probably has two main dimensions. One is to simplify the regulatory regimes. I don't think anyone in principle has a problem with regulation, oversight and audit, but the duplication and the micromanagement that we see at the moment is stifling. It consumes a huge amount of management time, which doesn't add any value either to the regulatory regime, and it certainly doesn't add any value to patient care, to be honest. And in fact, we've come across a number of examples where clinical staff, medical staff, nursing staff have had to be taken away from patient care in order to complete some of the audit and compliance paperwork, which requires specialist knowledge that managers don't have. Now, if we're taking clinical staff, trained, experienced clinical staff, away from patients in order to feed the regulatory beast, there must be something wrong. So I think simplifying, streamlining that regulatory regime, removing the micromanagement is one element. I think there's a second component, and that concerns medical and clinical relationships with managers. Most of what one reads in the press these days is critical of the NHS in general. One very rarely sees media accounts that praise the NHS, rarely, and most accounts of management in the NHS are also critical. So I think it is fair to say that managers have a bad name, and that is interfering with clinical managerial relationships. Doctors and managers, clinical staff and managers, in order to deliver the kinds of efficiency gains and changes that government is expecting, and quite frankly the NHS would support, needs better relationships between clinical staff and managerial staff. We need to find ways to strengthen that relationship and stop damaging it in public.
David, there's some very useful points to bear in mind there. Thank you very much.